Awesome. Well, I would first of all love to get a background on, where your career's at and how you got to the Southwest. I know you maybe spent some time in the Midwest. I was poking around on LinkedIn, of course. So yeah, I'd love to get a little background and just how you ended up in your current position.
It wasn't a very normal straight path. I was born and raised in Iowa, eastern Iowa, and oh, my parents were always outside. My dad, they were both biochemists, which meant that my dad had summers free. He taught at the University of Iowa, so we'd all, the '60s, pile the kids in the car and go out west for 2 or 3 weeks every summer. And I loved the West. And the first fire I ever saw was in Glacier National Park in 1967, and I still remember it. We were watching air tankers drop, and my dad loved it so much. He was just fascinated. He just stopped the car, and we all had to stand and watch for a long time. And I don't remember what my siblings thought. I thought it was pretty cool. Anyway, fast forward, we all occasionally, if you live in the West, will have some kind of encounter with wildfire, if only seeing smoke from a distance. Um, I ended up with a scholarship internship with the Nature Conservancy for 3 seasons doing tallgrass restoration when I was at the University of Iowa. And that was when I did my first prescribed fire, which was pretty addicting. It is. Um, I guess I always describe it as I was in my 30s when I first really discovered fire, and that became this new shiny thing that became the rest of my career and still is part of my major part of my life. Um, the more I work in fire, the more I realize how fundamental it is to almost every ecosystem in this country and how absent it is in most of them most of the time. Um, we have a public meeting tonight, and one of the points that I like to talk about, if only briefly, is to tell people you hear about fire adapted systems. They're not adapted to all fire. An example, two examples I'll give that are different. One is, say, ponderosa pine is kind of the poster child for fire adapted. Everybody knows it likes a lot of fire, keeps it open, keeps the little guys from growing up, and all of that. Um, so it's only adapted to low and mixed severity fire. Mixed meaning patches of high severity are fine, but great big huge areas should be and are pretty rare in areas that are going to be a huge ecosystem of ponderosa pine that is healthy. You're probably not going to see these big huge areas because, especially now, we don't really know what it's going to look like when new trees become mature. So ponderosa pine is mostly adapted to low and some mixed severity. A flip side of that would be a species called point leaf manzanita, which is a major component in the chaparral in the Southwest. It'll sprout a little bit if it gets top killed, but mostly it really needs a hot fire in order to scarify the seeds so that they'll resprout. So chaparral needs to have hot fire. It likes to burn to the ground once in a while. What becomes more important there is the patch size. So the fire there in chaparral, one of the critical things for fire to do is to sort of maintain a mosaic on the landscape so the whole thing doesn't blow at once, which we've seen periodically in California and here in Arizona. Um, oh, well, I'm, I'm babbling on. I will tend to do that, just a warning. Um, Back to where I was coming from. So I worked for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources for a couple of years. And then I did Nature Conservancy for 3 years, and then the Park Service. Well, those were seasons, not full years. And then the Park Service for 3 seasons. And then I was offered a permanent full-time job as a fire ecologist with the Forest Service in 2000. Well, I started January 4th or 7th, anyway, 2002. And it's been a really great career. There have been 3 jobs for me so far. The first was working in the Great Plains, and since my research, I got my PhD while I was working there, going back and forth to the University of Iowa to finish it, was looking at grassland thermodynamics. How hot does it get at what levels, and what are the impacts of soil moisture on the fire effects and things like that. Um, that was a great job too. I did a lot of different things because that particular job was in a forest that didn't have a hydrologist, didn't have a botanist, didn't have a soil scientist. I got to work with those programs, sometimes actually sort of being the program manager for all of these. It was just insane. but it was an interesting job. I really liked it. And I love living up in Chadron, Nebraska, my kind of place. And then I worked for the Forest Restoration Initiative. Have you heard of that?
I only have heard about it insofar as I saw it on your LinkedIn profile. And I was going to ask about it.
So, following the Rodeo Chetasky fire, the Forest Service got some of the affected forests in the Southwest to get together and say, this isn't working. Whatever you're doing, it's not working. Let's do something different. And about that time, Congress had passed the Collaborative Forest Restoration Act. And the Southwest region put together a request or a proposal for that. And from what I had heard, it came in number one out of 40 proposals, and they said it wasn't even close. And that proposal suggested that we could restore 2.4 million acres of ponderosa pine on the Apache sitgraves, the Tonto, the Coconino, and the Kaibab National Forests, which are all adjacent to each other, in a matter of 10 to 20 years. Needless to say, a pretty tall task. Needless to say, that didn't happen. But it did break an awful lot of ceilings, in particular with the size of project that the Forest Service takes on. It used to be that people would say, oh, wow, 50,000 acres. And now it's like, that's cute, you know? Anymore, hundreds of thousands of acres are pretty much the norm because we know we need to treat the landscape. And we did that. It took us 5 years to do the first EIS. And I left after about 2 years, I think, into the second one, something like that, to work here on the Tonto National Forest, which is one of my favorite jobs ever. The only hesitation there is I was thinking, oh, it was nice being a fire effects monitor as a GS5 seasonal. I had no responsibility. I do now, but on the other hand, I get to do a lot of different things and I really like it.
Hmm. Wait, so what is the status with the Four Forests Restoration Project?
They have finished and signed the second EIS. The landscape that was being considered originally would have included a third EIS, but the forest, it was the Apache sitgraves, realized, especially after the first 2 or 3 years of forest fire, that it was going to be quite some time before the core team could get over there. The core team was made up of myself as fire ecology, silviculture, wildlife, a NEPA coordinator, a GIS guy, and a watershed person, and then the team lead. And then I won't even get into the internal politics and some of that. Because it was such a visible project, we were literally reporting to Washington every month. Our stakeholders would go there once or twice a year. They can do that. We can't go there and lobby on our behalf, but they can and did. And they're still in place. The stakeholders still meet every month. So the NEPA is done on the first two big chunks of it, and they're in implementation mode, very much so. And they've done a lot. And even if it isn't at the scale and rate that originally everybody was hoping for, it's still a lot more, a lot faster than people were originally doing before Fry. And the areas being treated are much bigger. It's commonplace here in the Southwest now for people to talk about a prescribed fire of 5 to 10,000 acres. Like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And, it used to be, wow, it's 2,000 acres. That's huge. I remember when I worked for Badlands National Park, I was an interpretive ranger there, but everything I did at that point was already on fire. And I got red carded there for the first time at the government level and got to help on it was about a 3,000 acre prescribed fire, but it was in the Badlands. There was a lot of it that couldn't burn. At any rate, just the size of it was dropping people's jaws right and left because nobody had done that before. And now a 3,000 acre burn would be not that big a deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Dang.
Fortify changed the scale and rate of treatment, even if it didn't live up to what it was originally advertised as. Like a lot of big projects like that, it accomplished a lot of things that we never even thought about accomplishing. We didn't know needed to be done. And some
Mm-hmm.
of it was the scale and the size of the planning and the implementation. Some of it was the sequencing. One of the brick walls that we hit at one point, nobody saw it coming, although in retrospect, it's sort of a duh. When we're planning that huge of an area and the districts that are going to have that area cleared for NEPA to treat it, they realized, oh my gosh, all of a sudden they have hundreds of thousands of acres that need to have archaeological surveys before you can do anything. And the same for goshawks and, and all of the surveying and clearances that have to be acquired. Like, oh my gosh. So then we did what I think has become more standard now, which was a workforce analysis. So we get the NEPA done. Then what do you need in terms of what types of employees do you need to get the work done? Because it's a very different animal when you don't have to spend your employees on planning anymore. Do you have the people you need to get the implementation done? And the answer initially was no. So we started doing that as part of it. And that's now part of it with the big projects. Part of what you have to do is figure out, can you do the implementation? And if it's not, what do you need to do that? Anyway,
When did
it's,
that process start? You might have mentioned this, I just missed it.
well, you'd think I'd know cold when Rodeo Chetaskai started. Um, I don't. That was, I moved here for Four Fry in 2010, so it was a few years before that.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Cool. Okay. So I'm really curious about kind of the chaparral ecosystems, the grassland ecosystems. I think since I have focused so exclusively on timber ecosystems in the past, I'm curious to know how to differentiate between those two fire regimes. Like I know that there are some massive differences here, namely that one needs a good fair bit of fire, one maybe doesn't need as much, one's changing pretty dramatically because of the invasive grasses that are coming in, so can you just like give us the 101 on those differences?
Yep, and I'm going to add desert to that because you mentioned, I'm going to call them introduced grasses because there's a whole discussion to be had that is being had on the difference between naturalized and introduced and invasive and non-native and in all of those. In the northern and the southern Sonoran Desert, there are two different grass species that are primarily the issues. In the northern Sonoran Desert, which is the Tonto, it's a grass called Bromus rubens, red brome. It's basically the desert version of cheatgrass. It's a first cousin. Bromus tectorum, Bromus rubens does the same thing in the desert that cheatgrass does in the sage systems up north. That's been the main driver for fires for us, including some really big fires like the bushfire that burned about 87,000 acres of desert. Um, the desert is basically changing into a grass system where fire can get to. It's going to become, is becoming, I should say, patchier as things like saguaro are forced to kind of retreat up to rocky south slopes where grass can't grow well enough to carry fire at this point. At this point, I don't think we're necessarily going to lose a lot of species, but the structure of the system is changing. I have a whole talk I gave on this at the Monterey conference last December. It's based partly on human ignitions. So if you were to draw a map on fire frequency as part of the regimes, along certainly on the Tonto and I think a lot of the West, you would see those lines representing roads and recreation areas where there's a lot of people because our impacts there are just pretty impressive. The starts, there are phenomenal numbers of starts along roads. It's just crazy. And when you add that to the lightning ignitions, it's changed our whole system. And then you add the grasses to that now fill in these areas that used to be open. Have you been to the Sonoran Desert?
I have not.
So historically, you would have patches of vegetation, a Palo Verde tree with a saguaro or two, some mesquite, but clumps. And there would be areas between them that most of the time, most years, didn't have anything. And so even though you get a fair amount of lightning during monsoon, it might burn up one blob. That's the technical term of vegetation, but it couldn't really go anywhere. So once in a great while, and we don't really know how often at all, there'll be a warm season. Monsoon will come in such a way that the warm season grasses that are native to the deserts will grow up and provide a contiguous fuel load. It's a little patchy, but it can carry fire. The cool thing was that I got to see that already. Having only worked in the desert since 2018, we've had a lot of fire. And 2 of the years, the fires we had were driven by red brome here on the Tonto. And then the next, so that was 2019, 2020. And then in 2021, we had a really dry winter and we just had the residual litter from the grass that was grown the 2 years before. And then we had monsoon. And for whatever reason, the monsoon temperature and precip and the timing was such that the native grasses all came up and it was really beautiful. But of course, it provided more fuel. So the following year, we got another big fire in the desert. And so the desert's changing. I guess the way I keep saying it is we don't really know exactly what the ecological trajectory is of the Sonoran Desert. We know it's changing fast, largely due to introduced grasses, which have been there now. Red brome's been there for over 100 years. So at what point do you stop calling it introduced? I don't know. As the system sort of equilibrates as best it can to having that be a major part of it, maybe we'll get back into a drier period after a while. There's sort of a 30-year cycle that I hear about of wet and dry in the desert, and how that affects and is affected by climate change. I don't know. I haven't been here long enough. But anyway, it's pretty complex. What's
Yeah.
definite is the desert is turning into grassland of some sort. It's
Mhm.
pretty obvious. That's what it looks like. I'd show you pictures of it. I look at areas when I'm driving through it now and I think, wow, I would think I was in South Dakota, except for those
Wow.
dead squirrels.
What is
Yeah.
that like to see that, to witness that type conversion somewhat in real time?
You know, I keep bringing that up with people right now, especially the younger fire folks who don't know how rare it is to see an ecosystem shifting this fast into something else irretrievably. You cannot go back and it, I'm not sure what to say. I'm trying to get over being really sad about it, and kind of successfully, because it is what it is. Mother Nature is not cruel or kind or anything. It just is, right? And so the grasses are changing. I'm not trying to show you what I was talking about here. Um, the grasses are just growing there, and they are now going to be doing who knows what. If you have grasses growing thickly in soil every year, you're going to start eventually seeing some increased organic matter, which is likely at some point going to start changing the potential for growing things. We are already seeing a lot more. Um, we know, for example, that I think it's nitrogen. I can't remember the paper that becomes much higher in the sorry, I'm also trying to pull this up real quick and quit trying to talk and do this. There we go. Um, it changes the nutrients that are available and how available they are. And there you are. Okay, I was trying to find you again. Um, and I will get also, if you have time, to ponderosa pine and chaparral. More talk about the chaparral because we have a public meeting tonight, and
Mhm.
I'm going to focus on it's the Globe Ranger District who is having it, and so I'm going to focus on what they have as far as fire regimes and so on. And I'm going to talk to them about the ponderosa pine and mixed conifer and then chaparral, because I guess my opening line for that is, how many of you have ever turned to your partner and said, it's a beautiful evening, let's go for a walk in the chaparral? Said nobody ever. You can't walk through it very well. Nobody thinks it's pretty. It's great habitat for birds and critters. From a fire management perspective, it's difficult. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh boy. Um, how to change that?
I've done it before.
Share.
Do you have a share screen option?
I d- um I do. Let me. There we go. All right, you should be good.
Okay. Tell me when you are looking at my screen.
I see it.
Okay.
Cool.
So this is a talk that I gave at the International Fire Ecology Conference last year. And
Cool.
for the record, this particular picture is rare. That's actually fog in the Sonoran Desert.
Oh wow. Nice.
It's not the norm. That was actually on, oh, it's one of those times when it's like, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. They wanted our hydrologist had set up a rafting trip down the Salt River in the Salt River Wilderness because she wanted us to do a watershed assessment in there. And it's like, okay. But I almost died because we went down into a big hole. The river was at twice as high as anyone is ever supposed to really do anything on it.
Oh
And
wow.
it was interesting, but it was
Wow.
pretty.
Went for a little swim.
Yeah, I guess I was, by the time they got me back in the raft eventually after
Good. Good.
some really unfun time in the water. And I remember sitting in the bottom of the raft and thinking, well, I may be 63, but I guess I'm still doing stuff.
That's good. That's good.
It's a good attitude, I thought. So
Um,
blah, blah,
a
blah, blah,
quick
blah.
a quick reminder on this, because it's not going to be a video when I post this podcast. It's just audio. So if you could just like, I don't know, talk your way through it as much as you
I
can.
will.
Yeah.
And then you might be able to pick up ways to clarify it if you can see this.
Yep.
So I'm assuming you're videoing this so you can go back and look at these if you want.
Yep.
So this is
Exactly.
the Tonto National Forest, and the part of us that is in purple is desert. The numbers aren't as important right now, 876,000, blah, blah, blah. So if you take out those areas that have burned, it becomes a little bit smaller. These are areas we don't really know the role of fire. We just know it didn't burn a lot. This is lightning strikes over a period of 10 years, showing you by the month. So as expected in the Southwest here, the lightning gets much more intense when monsoon kicks in. And so that's when a lot of the fires would start in June. What's happening is there's a high pressure center set up that's getting hotter and hotter in the desert. And so that, of course, is a big lift. And as it gets hotter, it sucks more and more moisture in from the Gulf of California and sometimes even the Gulf of Mexico. So by late June, early July, we're starting to get thunderstorms, although most of them are dry. It's going to be a lot of dry lightning initially, and then they pick up rain, and we get monsoon is rain almost every day for a couple of months. Although it's a clear day in the morning, and then the thunderheads develop, you get big storms in the afternoon that are scattered, and then by evening, it's tearing itself apart in a beautiful sunset. So anyway, the difference then between June and then boom, here's July for lightning strikes.
Wow.
And that's just in the low country. You ought to see it when I show you the high country.
Oh my
So this
gosh.
is how that translates into fires. These are lightning fires. Pretty much nothing in January, February, March. In April, boom, we have 5. These are just in the desert. 80 in the May, June, and then July. This is over a period of 50 years. Our fire history expands to 53 years. 394, and then it goes down from there as you'd expect. So we did get lightning fires. What we don't know is how many of these fires are because of the introduced grasses and how many actually would have burned on their own. Likely a
Mm,
lot of them would have burned on their own, but they would have stuck to the clump of vegetation that was ignited. Or if it was really windy and kind of dry, they might have spread a little bit here and there, but most years the fires in the desert would have been very small. And
wow.
here's our human caused fires. You're starting right out with 81 in January. Tells you already it's going to be a very different pattern. And these again are just fires in the Sonoran Desert. And you can start to see as it gets to be what most people would consider recreation period, vacation time. I guess it's when school is out. You can see the roads already
Yeah.
because there are so many ignitions along the roads that
Wow.
you can see them on a map. When you map them out, there are lines of ignitions that echo our major highways and blobs of ignitions that show you where our major recreation areas are.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So this is the change here is if you put together all of our lightning fires and now you have to combine them with our human caused fires because that is part of our actual fire regime now. And we don't think about that enough. So as I mentioned earlier, if we were going to draw lines around our fire regimes based on frequency, they would very much be echoing our roads and our rec areas, with those areas showing up as high frequency.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that was what I wanted to
That's
show you.
fascinating. Wait, I would like to chat more about the idea of, yeah, human fires should be included in a fire regime. Like that's actually not something I'd considered necessarily. Um, can you speak
Yeah,
more
I
to
mean, if
that?
you look at it, it's a matter of they're not going to get to be a whole lot less. We actually have fewer starts now than we did 50 years ago, but the fires tend to be bigger for lots of
Mm-hmm.
reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're trying to figure out what is the fire regime, I I think historically it was maybe pretty important to understand what the natural fire regime would be, and by that I mean mostly lightning
Mm-hmm.
um, versus human. But you know what the Prairie Peninsula is?
No, I don't.
In the central part of our country, if you map the prairie, mostly the tallgrass prairie, you map it, you can see the influence of the wind coming from the west, and then roughly at about Missouri, the Mississippi River thereabouts, it starts to kind of funnel its way up as sort of a jet stream in the way things move, and goes up through Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and then kind of fades out in there. So it's sort of pointing. It's almost like an arrow that points, this prairie peninsula ends up pointing out through the northern Midwestern states, Illinois,
Cool.
Indiana, Ohio, because the fires that started, that were mostly human starts in the mixed or the tallgrass prairie, they would blow that way. It's that pattern, and so the prairie shows up that way. And so the same thing would be true also. I saw it when I worked in at Badlands National Park and spent a lot of time in South Dakota when I lived in Nebraska as well for almost 10 years. If you go to, say, Fort Pierre, South Dakota, even today, if you look at the east side of the river versus the west and compare how much the eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, has moved into those areas, the fires would have moved there from west to east most of the time. And so there's a lot more of those trees on the east side because the fire wouldn't knock them out so much. And so a lot of those would have been accidents. A lot of them would have been human caused. I'm guessing Native Americans would think it's kind of silly to separate them. I know in South Africa, they do. I'd put on a conference or a grassland session at International Fire Ecology Conference a few years back when I was still in Nebraska. And I got some people to come from South Africa, and Trollope is his last name. Anyway, he was really confused for a while. He did not understand why we would separate lightning fires and human-caused fires. Because, of course, from there, in Africa, human-caused fires have been around for a million years.
Mm-hmm.
So why would you? And I've come to that thinking a little bit. I don't necessarily think it's bad to track human fires and lightning fires separately, but I think we need to understand the human fires, like it or not, are part of the system, and ignoring them doesn't let us respond to what's out there for real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the ways that humans are lighting fires are shifting and in some ways feeling a little bit more inevitable with like power lines and infrastructure and
Absolutely. Yeah.
the mass amounts of people recreating in public lands. Yeah, it just seems like it's an inevitability that humans would continue to cause fires. I mean, whether
It's
that's,
part of it's part of
yeah.
the pattern that we have not been paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we look at our lightning patterns, which are really heavy up in the high elevations. We get a whole lot more. And the systems that are up at high elevations here are mostly pretty flammable. I'd be pretty interested actually in seeing what the lightning load looks like in a really high mountain range. Is it really high? Do you get more lightning in alpine areas or not?
I
I
don't
don't know
think
the
so.
answer to that.
I don't know either.
Now I'm
Interesting.
curious. Huh, hadn't thought about that. So this is a sequence. This is at Tonto National Monument, which is surrounded by the Tonto National Forest. And you see the size of the shrubs in the foreground?
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty big and they're pretty small back here
Oh, yeah.
because this area in the back burned. I don't know when. This is a Park Service property and I didn't have the fire history for it. But this was the day before we knew this area was going to end up getting burned. There was a big fire called the Woodbury Fire that was headed this way, and we weren't going to be able to stop it. So the park asked me to come in and do some photo points for them. So this was about 2 days later, and oops. And then this was the next year. Like,
Oh, wow.
okay, wait a minute. This is just almost exactly a year later. This is still dominated by red brome, which is what you saw in that first photo.
Yeah.
But there's some natives in here. But okay, so this is an area that clearly can burn 2 years running now. No problem.
Yeah.
And then we had, so that was 2019, 2020. And then 2021, this is almost all native grasses. This is when we had the monsoon that brought in the warm season native grasses. The others were all cool season. And at this point, I'm
Interesting.
just scratching my head and thinking, oh my God, I really don't understand the system yet. I don't know what to make of it. And so this was a year later. And one of the things that is really telling here is to look at the shrubs in the background. These shrubs had not recovered yet to the size of those in the foreground that had not burned. And over here, they're even smaller. and
Mm.
the grass will be even denser. I didn't retake them last year. I'll need to do that this year.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's what's happening, is it really is turning into, do I have that one sequence in here? I don't. But this is what I meant by the historic veg. Most years
Right.
there's nothing growing in between the patches of vegetation. So it'd be hard for the fire to grow around, to move around very well. Yeah, I don't have the one I was hoping I did, but it's not here.
That's cool.
So
Do
there's
you think you
that.
could actually share, could you share that with me so I could share it with folks so that they could maybe
Yeah,
be able to go through it while they're listening or something? Um,
absolutely.
I don't know if that is going to be, if that's going to work for folks, but I want
I'm
people to
happy
have
to
those
share that.
images.
You bet.
Cool. That was super interesting. Yeah, I feel like, yeah, I learned a lot there. That was amazing. And we did it. We had a nice couple little of tangents as well. Um, okay, so bringing it back. Um, First of all, you said something that you liked Nebraska, that Nebraska was
Oh,
like the
yeah.
place for you. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I grew up in eastern Iowa, and although people would deny it, eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, actually a lot of Iowa, are awfully similar. I've always loved the West. As I mentioned, we went on vacations out west every year, and I had these little cameras back when you had Instamatics and stuff, and I would take pictures of the Great Plains as we went through, and I'd show them to people later, thinking, "Aren't these cool?" And they'd be like, "Yeah, no, it's so."
Where are the mountains?
I love grasslands. I always have. And so the Nebraska National Forest and grasslands, and we just call it the Nebraska. It includes Fort Pierre, Buffalo Gap, and Uglala National Grasslands, and the Nebraska and McKelvey National Forests. And the supervisor's office for those units is up in Chadron, Nebraska, which is about 15 miles south of the South Dakota line and maybe 50, 40 miles from Wyoming. So it's way shoved up there in the northwest corner, and that's the part I really loved. Um,
Mm.
I like dry grasslands, although I did a lot of work in tall grass. I like dry ecosystems, although it's really showing on my face these days. Um,
What is it about them? What do you like? Yeah, I'm so curious what it is about like dry ecosystems that just feels like it draws you in.
there's no ticks and not a ton of poison ivy. Well,
That's
I shouldn't
great.
say no ticks. Let me rephrase that. There are definitely ticks in the Great Plains. Um, there aren't many down here. I've seen one since I got to Arizona.
Oh wow.
And if you took out last year, I could say that I could count all the mosquitoes in our house on one hand after 13 years of living there. I
Okay,
like that.
yeah. That's valid. Very valid.
I'm not fond of humidity. When I worked for the Nature Conservancy in the summer, we spent a lot of time in Iowa, some in Nebraska, a little in Minnesota and South Dakota. Um, Literally, I remember pouring sweat out of my rubber boots when we were spraying leafy spurge for a few weeks, and we would start at sunrise because it would get so darn hot, and then we had to quit when it got to be, I forget, like 90, no, like 9 o'clock or 80 degrees, whichever happened first, we'd have to stop. And literally at that point, you are pouring the sweat out of your boots because you have to wear the Tyvek's head to toe because it was Tordon, the not the RTU, the nasty one. But anyway,
Oh, that's nasty.
I like being able to walk through areas. I like being able to see. So I've never been a fan of what I realize now in my old age, or mostly overgrown, not healthy forests that you can't
Mm.
walk through them and you can't see through them very far. And I don't like that. A lot of that is because we took fire out of the system. Going back to one of my first comments, that as I get older, I realize how ubiquitous fire was across this world, certainly in this country. Even deciduous forests in the east, and certainly in the southeast, and even up into Maine and so on. The Native American burning did a lot to keep areas open, and
Hmm.
we're not used to seeing it that way.
Hmm.
Grasslands are subtle too.
They're
When
what?
they're subtle.
Oh,
Do you
subtle.
are you familiar? You're familiar with land fire stuff, land fire data?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you looked at any of the biophysical descriptions?
No.
So they're pretty excruciatingly detailed descriptions of various types of ecosystems, which we tend to use a lot when we're trying to describe other systems. They are considered a really good source. If you want to describe your landscape, that's something you might want to bring in and look at. So when they were first deciding they were going to do it for the Great Plains, they got together a bunch of people who were experts on grasslands. And I was one of those. There were a bunch of managers, a bunch of researchers, folks like that. And the first thing they first broke us up into groups based on if we were splitters or lumpers. They gave us a test to tell us if we were a splitter or a lumper, because they didn't want all of, any one group to be made up of all one or the other. And then they said, so here's where we're starting. We thought there's probably about 3 different kinds of grasslands to be had in the Great Plains. The room just erupted into laughter. And I don't know how many kinds we ended up with. There were multiple wetland types, the tall grasses, the short grasses, the sand prairies, just so many different types by the time we were done. And by that's, it is kind of subtle. If you just look across the grasslands, it's like grass, right? I don't know. I like the sun. I like big open areas.
Yeah.
Surprised at how much I'm liking the desert, because ponderosa pine is still my favorite tree. But
Yeah, definitely. And you have you have ponderosas on the Tonto, right? I mean, in the higher elevation or mid
this
elevation.
part of Arizona supports the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in the world.
Ooh,
Well,
amazing.
so
Not know
saying
that.
that, it's because I'm American that I say it that way. Ponderosa
Right.
pine, I don't think grows on other continents, but we have the biggest one here in northern Arizona, actually. Um,
Wow.
I didn't realize that either until I was probably in my 40s.
Hmm.
I thought of Arizona, as my mother-in-law did, as being all deserty kind of stuff.
I think
She
that's how
came
I
to
think of
visit
it
us.
too.
What's that?
That's how I think of it too. I think it's because I grew up in the Midwest and that was what I knew about air. That's what you learn about Arizona when you grow up in
Yeah,
Michigan.
it's about Roadrunner cartoon, right? That's what it's
Hmm.
all. um, Boy, well, do you know much about Flagstaff?
No, I
Flagstaff,
somehow
for
never
me,
made it.
where'd you go to school?
Northern Michigan University.
Okay, so Flagstaff to me is in the same category as Iowa City, Fort Collins,
Mm,
Boulder, Lansing, um, Berkeley, some of the more
yeah.
radical big university towns. Flagstaff feels like that very much. It's a great place to live, and it is so in the pines. When I first asked a friend of mine if he'd ever been there, because I was looking at this job that would have me living there, I said, "What's it like there?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you can't really tell that you're in a town of any size because they keep the buildings really low, and all you see is ponderosa pine forest everywhere in every direction," which is true.
Hmm.
Well, it was true. We won't get into the politics and the developers that now live in Flagstaff.
Yes, yeah, well, I guess so you live in Flagstaff. I mean, you guys have done some really cool work in like the watershed collaborative movement to kind of build watershed resilience with like a lot of folks in the community. It seems like congregating around this idea of building watershed resilience and having a lot of collaborative partnerships working towards that. Seems like you guys are kind of one of the leading, like when I think of these collaboratives working, I think of Flagstaff, I think of like Boulder has one, I think, like the Poudre River watershed. Does that sound familiar to you?
I know in the time I've worked for the Forest Service, it went from being individual areas to starting to focus on the watershed as the main unit for ecological reasons that make an enormous amount of sense, rather than
Hmm.
breaking watersheds up. It just is silly. But
Hmm.
I'm not aware specifically of that. The only collaborative I've worked closely with was the Forefry Collaborative, and we did talk about watersheds there, but the focus was ponderosa pine forest.
Hmm.
Let me show you a little bit again. This is the not quite done presentation I'll do tonight at the public meeting. Are you
Okay.
still looking at my screen? Did I not ever?
Oh, I took it away because
What? Yeah,
there
hold
you
on.
go.
Share screen and show you a little bit of the chaparral too.
Hmm.
Because I'm more intrigued by chaparral than I used to be, but It's like, well, okay. From a management perspective, it's difficult. So this is my cover slide for it. This is the top of Pinnell Peak. Notice the aspen and the fir, and there's actually maple up there as well, granulatum, the big tooth maple. So Doug fir, white fir, aspen, ponderosa pine. It's not the Arizona that you and I thought of when we were growing
Yeah.
up. And then this is chaparral a couple of years after a burn. This is a perfectly normal, healthy state for it. But you get these really striking flowers that come out after the burn.
Mm.
I'm going to just go ahead. I can fast forward through some stuff. So it's pretty complex. The black is outlining the district that I'm going to be talking on and about tonight.
Mm.
The orange is chaparral, the yellow is grassland. When I talk to these folks, I'm going to simplify it like this into frequent, infrequent fire systems for the most part, and then desert, just to help them
Wow.
understand a little bit about the complexity of managing and trying to understand these landscapes. This is, oh, let me go back since you can only use verbal stuff. When you look at a landscape and you're trying to talk to the public, it's sometimes very helpful to help have them understand. I kind of break it down into three systems that is good for them to understand. One is frequent fire with low severity, because that is the ponderosa pine forest, it's some of the deciduous forests in the east and so on. Frequent fire with high severity is super important because those are our grasslands, so helping them understand what that's all about. And then infrequent fire systems, which covers a lot of things in terms of patchiness and chaparral versus lodgepole pine. They're all in the infrequent, but it depends on the system you're looking at. So to help the public understand that most landscapes in the West are a mix of ecosystems that need to burn frequently with low severity, that need to burn frequently with high severity, and that need to burn infrequently, but with various patch sizes. We also have riparian. The desert we've talked about already. The riparian, we don't have a lot of good info on if somebody's really wanting more dissertation work. I think probably across the country, work on riparian fire regimes would be good. In my mind, what I tell people, and when I work with our forest on that stuff, we approach it as the riparian fire regimes are closely related to the fire regimes adjacent to them.
Yeah.
So if it's a frequent fire system adjacent to it, it probably burns kind of frequently, but not as frequently of the areas around it because the soil moisture is higher and the humidity is going to be a little bit higher and so on. So generally, they're not usually going to burn as often. And then there's the lightning sequence again, because everybody loves that one. These are lightning fires. These are human fires. Again, the roads just really stand out and the rec areas. And then I show the whole thing. These are our fires. If we have perimeters, they're here. The 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. And the point here is if you look at them all together, you can kind of see what's going on. We actually have fewer starts. Each one of those dots is a fire that somebody responded to. There's fewer starts now, but the fires are bigger.
Wow.
And that
Yeah. Super
really
clear.
shows up here. But anyway, so this is more typical northern Arizona, just so you have an image. This is a plot that went through a couple of fires, but in ponderosa pine. We have a lot of small oak understory. You and I are oak snobs. So somebody who grew up here might be thinking this oak is pretty cool, this one over here on the right. Or wow, here's a nice looking one here. And you and I would look at it and go, yeah, all right, maybe. And then just showing a little bit to help people understand what a fire looks like, kind of what it feels like to be there on the ground. Most of what we see when we look at videos of fire is based on big crown fires and the big showy stuff. But in fact, this is where most of the work is done, and this is how most of the work is done. So
Yeah, that's great.
it's pretty typical. Alligator junipers, they're so cool. 30. And then, I don't know if I'll have time for all of this, but this one and then showing what happens if you open it up a little bit and put some slash on the ground. So that last video was maybe 100 feet off of this. So there's a mastication line. Sorry, I'm being confusing here. There's a mastication line from this road over about 100 feet. And so there's a lot of slash fuel in here on the ground. That last video of the really well-behaved fire was about 100 feet in from the slash line in the forest over here. And then this is showing the difference when you open it up a little bit and you have a little more woody fuel on the ground. This is us creating a fire line, actually. So it looks a little more alarming, but when it gets into that area that is heavily shaded, the relative humidity is higher. Normally the soil moisture would also be a little higher, but this area was just masticated about a week before this, so it wouldn't have changed that much yet. But just the drying out of the fuels and a little more wind makes such a difference in what we see on the ground. But this fire, for the most part, is not a problem for these trees, even when it climbs up them like that. It's rarely going to get all the way up on a long stem like that. So here's where you can talk about canopy base height and the role that it plays. So here's the chaparral. And you see this huge field of chaparral, right? And this is actually decadent chaparral that has not burned for, well, we don't have a history of fire in this area. So it's safe to say this area hasn't burned in at least 50 years. And what happens in shrubby fuel, certainly in the chaparral that you find in Arizona, which is called interior chaparral, is that little by little, the shrubs themselves will drop more litter and they will start to drop small branches. And say the manzanita especially is going to start having larger dead branches that are just in there. And so it becomes more and more primed for fire. And unlike in a ponderosa pine forest, where you get the buildup of fuels to what might be an unnatural accumulation, in this case, this is perfectly happy. This is perfectly normal. This fire and how it's burning is well within the historic range of variability. And this particular fire is really good. Excellent benefits. Although it's not something you want to be close to. So when it's your job to do something with the fuels and people say, decrease the fuels here, you're going to have a hard time doing it with fire, although ecologically that would be the healthiest thing for it. And then this, so the part we were just looking at burning is over here. And I was right about here taking that picture or the movie and looking up this way. And so this is before that fire. That was the Pinal fire in 2017. This is post-fire. You can see the patchiness of it, which was really exactly what we needed in there. And what happened a couple of years ago in 2021, there was a nasty, big, horrible, well, I did say that. It was a not very beneficial fire, and it was coming from the right side of the screen. It was moving down here with a wind of only about 8 miles an hour. So it wasn't too bad. And by the time it got over here, so there was fire a little further down here, but there was a fire along here that was not too bad given that it was chaparral, but then there was a strong wind gust on this picture. It would be from the right to the left. And so it was blowing the fire uphill through decadent chaparral this direction. When it hit this area, the area that had burned, it just dropped to the ground. It could not burn in here. Again, not that soon. And that was a good thing, because if it had, it would have moved into this area, and then the wind would have shifted back where it had been, and it would have blown the fire this way. And there are houses and homes up in this canyon and this one, and there's another one over here. And there's nothing we could have done because we already had committed all the resources. We were at planning level 5 nationally and in the Southwest. Anyway, so this fire that you're looking at right now, the effects of this fire are the main reason that we didn't get fire coming in the globe in 2021. And on a different scale, why is this not moving? There we go. This is just a little closer up, shows you where the fire stopped. So this is the fire that I just mentioned that occurred in 2021, this big black area. Actually, this was a separate one, and that's what really stopped it. But You see this sort of frowny face in the middle in green? Are you still there?
Yes, I can see it. Sorry, I was nodding.
Okay. So that's the fire I was just telling you about. And this part at the top here is the part that was the chaparral that I was just showing you burned with high severity. I was standing about here when I took those photos, looking this way at the fire as it was burning. So this top part of this was chaparral that burned with high severity. When the telegraph fire came in, it came roaring up from this side. That's not an understatement. They were doing a burnout, bringing fire down this way. And the main fire was kind of working its way up here. And then the wind turned, and that's when it blew it straight up towards this area. But it couldn't get into this area that had already burned. Otherwise, it would have gone there and gone into town. Come on. So that was the Pinal fire right there, right in the middle of the telegraph fire. And you can also see the scars of previous fires. This was 2011, the Frio fire here, and you can see, especially on this side, the effect of having had a previous burn in there not that long before. The Pioneer fire over here on the right actually didn't burn a lot. From people who were on that fire told me, yeah, there's big areas that didn't burn at all, but you can still see the outline of the fire, of the bottom part. And the Pinal fire just stands out like nobody's business because it had burned recently. And I actually published an article on that in Fire Management Today. I did an analysis of the litter and the duff and the heating and how that whole thing came down.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then there's this little thing. I know we need to be done before too long, but are you familiar at all with smoke ecology?
Yeah, kind of, somewhat.
So I started doing these experiments in 2014 because I was just curious. I'd seen some work by John Keeley and a guy named Scott Abella, and I decided it was time I started testing my own. So I've only got one species I'm showing the results for here, but I've tested almost 100 by now. With this one, where there's no smoke in the equation at all, and all I do is plant 108 seeds in soil, I got about 16 to sprout. I've tested this species 5 times now with similar results. And Scott Abella tested it too with almost identical results. Where there's soil is smoked and the seed is not, then I get 64 sprouts. Where the seed is smoked and the soil is not, 41. Where both are smoked, 69. And then various results where I smoke the seed and let it sit with the smoke residue on it for a while. Graphs are always easier, so that's the control. Or it's easier to show things. This is when I smoke the soil, but not the seed. That's smoking the seed, but not the soil. That's when I smoke both. That's when I smoke the seed and the soil and let it sit for, I think it was 10 days before I plant it. And then that's where I smoke the soil, the seed, but not the soil, and let it sit. So put it all together. There's a lot going on out there. This is just smoke. It's not the seeds. I mean, it's not heat at all. It's just smoke.
Wow.
And so, you know, the consequences or the implications of that are enormous, but nobody knows much about that yet. And, you know,
I should do
there's
an
more
episode on
dissertations.
smoke ecology.
What's that?
I should definitely do an episode on smoke ecology.
Yeah, there's John Keeley would be somebody you absolutely need to talk to on that, but you'll need to yell at him to make him use common names.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so before we take off, I don't know, when do you need to take off?
I can chat for a little bit yet. I just thought, you know, I've been going on and on with stuff. So
Yeah, yeah. I'm just like I'm curious if I'm going to be able to use anything with the presentation just because most people won't watch the video.
mhm.
It's definitely my audience is definitely mostly audio, and so I'm hoping to get a little bit more. I am curious kind of like what restoration work you're working on right now within the forest. What are your projects right now, if any? I don't know.
So the biggest project we have on the forest right now is, well, there are 2. One is still fry or implementation
Yep,
here.
yep.
And then the other one is the San Carlos Tribal Forest Protection Act project. I know that's a big mouthful. And it's similar to Forfry in that it's multiple agencies. So it's the San Carlos Apache, it's the Coronado National Forest and the Tonto National Forest, all working together. Again, very similar to Forfry in restoring the landscape resilience. And we talk
Hmm.
more these days when we say the words restore, it's more about restoring resilience than it is restoring what happened 100 years ago with the vegetation, because climate change is something we're allowed to believe in now. And so we can implement that. And
Yeah.
I remember I was with the fort. Actually, it was early on in Forfry. So like it was the early, I think the early 2000 or the early 2010s when we were officially told, okay, now you have to include climate change in NEPA. Prior to that, it was something you just kind of tiptoed around, and people got unhappy if you talked about it too explicitly in some cases.
Are you able, so when you talk about it, for example, will you talk about it at the public meeting that you're holding tonight? Is that
I
something that the
will.
public is feeling receptive to in your experience?
There's a wide variety. There's people who just think you know, they're just being nice and nodding, and other people who are all over it and wondering why we're not moving faster. It's a real variety with the
Yeah.
public. One
How do
of
you
the
tackle
things,
that? Oh, go ahead.
well, when I was an interpretive ranger at Badlands, one of the talks or walks I did was a geology walk. And towards the end of one walk, everybody was gone except for this one couple. And he came up and he said, now, understanding that I know the earth only took 6,000 years, can you explain to me how this landscape formed? And
Oh
I said,
boy.
well, um, I said, I tell you what, I'll describe the processes as I understand them and you can fill in the numbers yourself. We left it at that. And so when it comes down to climate change, I don't know that it's my job to convince people of the causes and the reasons because I don't understand them in the detail that maybe I would need to.
Yeah.
But I do understand and see some of the changes, and those I can describe. And a good example of that would be um, where the telegraph fire, for example, burned with really high severity. Does it make sense to go in there and plant ponderosa pine, which a mature ponderosa pine, 50 to 100 years, and they live to be 2 or 3 or 400. There's some that are even older than that. But does it make sense to plant that at that elevation that far south at this time? Is it still going to be there? Can it even mature? We don't know the answers to those. The fact that we're asking those questions is good. And so there's a species in the Southwest, and we have it on the Tonto as well, called Chihuahua pine, and it's a sprouter. And it's much more tolerant of drought, of the dry, hot conditions that we know we're going to see. So our silviculturist crew has been waiting for a year. When they have a good cone year, then they will go collect those cones and send those to nurseries to grow out so that in the future, when we need to replant after high severity fire that we thought was too much, then we'll be able to use some different species. And
Interesting.
then there's another species called Apache pine, which is also just a little further south. Maybe we have some, but we haven't seen it yet. There's something called assisted migration, which I imagine you're familiar with.
Hmm.
That would be a species that we would definitely consider for assisted migration because given climate change, it's going to do really well up here for a very long time while the ponderosa pine starts to withdraw from some of the more harsh areas.
Now, I know assisted migration, and it's a fairly obvious concept. I think it's pretty telling what the name of it is anyway, but could you explain it just in sort of layman terms?
Sure. So, for example, ponderosa pine is really common on the Tonto National Forest. Apache pine is a kind of pine that grows further south. The extreme northern part of its range may or may not include parts of the Tonto. We have not seen it yet. But because that species will do a lot better than ponderosa pine, when climate change sets in as it gets hotter and drier, it would be a really good balance for us to actually take some and plant it on the Tonto. When we need to replant trees, ponderosa pine may not do as well, and if we can bring it up and plant Apache pine, it should do well. And in structure and form, it's very similar to ponderosa. And I would add to that that if it was left on its own, if we didn't have so much human impact between the Tonto and where it's normal and where the range of the Apache pine normally is, it might find its way up here eventually on its own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're just seeing that shift happening. Like the further north you go, the those type conversions are happening. Just it seems like things are just shifting north. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they're shifting north and they're
Or
shifting
higher.
up. Yep,
Yeah.
up and north.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many areas. It's not, I don't think, quite as bad in a lot of Arizona, but there are certainly parts of the country where areas, I'm going to call them natural areas, are much more isolated and impacted by a lack of connectivity with areas around them. So wildlife corridors in particular are probably getting a little more press than plant corridors, if you want to call them that.
Mm-hmm.
We have the Sky Islands in the Southwest, which are a series of mountains, not the huge mountains you get in the Northern Rockies and the Southern Rockies, but mountains or huge hills, whatever you want to call them, that go up 5, 6, 7, 8,000 feet. And they have forested vegetation on top, but they're separate. There's no connection. There's no corridor of trees between them. And so they have some really interesting plants and interesting systems within them. That's
Mm-hmm.
more typical down here, which is why I'm wondering if maybe we don't have some Apache pine that we just haven't found yet,
Mm-hmm.
because it does work its way around.
Yeah. Interesting. Um, Back to the grassland. I kind of wrapping up here soon. I was reading a story from I can't remember where, but effectively you were quoted as saying the genie's out of the bottle in terms of some of these invasive, non-native, all those other descriptive words you used, all these grasses. The genie's out of the bottle, so we kind of have to learn to live like manage within the what we have, we have to manage what we have, what we've been given. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all and kind of like what that actually looks like in the Tonto, maybe in the broader Southwest too, if you have that that background.
I can tell you what I'm familiar with. So I'd
Hmm.
mentioned that in the northern Sonoran Desert, the biggest non-native grass that we have in terms of area is red brome in the
Yeah,
desert.
right.
And in the southern part of the Sonoran Desert, it is buffalo grass, not buffalo grass, but buffalo grass.
Hmm.
That is a perennial warm season grass, where the red brome is an annual cool season grass. And so the impacts, for reasons I don't need to explain in detail right now, are quite different. But in both cases, it's a non native grass that's been introduced, which is changing the system because it can carry fire and it can grow every year and it's highly flammable. And because it's spread over such wide areas, we can't spray it out of the system. We can't
Hmm.
pull it out of the system. It probably is possible, and maybe in a lot of cases advisable, if you have a relatively small preserve that you're managing, maybe just a few thousand acres, maybe you could find a way to keep it out of there. But the Tonto, for example, has about 176,000 or 876,000 acres. Let me restate that. The Tonto has about 876,000 acres of Sonoran Desert. We can't pull it out of that. We can't spray it out of that. The
Hmm.
fires burn. We actually have some going right now while we're speaking down in the desert, being fueled by these grasses. Um, we're not going to be able to get rid of them. And so there's another bad species coming in called stinknet, which is spreading at a very alarming rate, and it also carries fire. So these species come in and we make attempts to get rid of them. And in some cases, we can do that pretty effectively. Um, in the case of these grasses right now, I have not seen or heard anything that makes me think there's any way to get rid of them on any kind of a scale that's going to matter for the Sonoran Desert as an ecosystem.
Hmm.
So I think it behooves us to try and understand the changing role of, of disturbance in this system. Fire is going to be more frequent, it is already. And the grasses are going to make changes on their own, both in terms of habitat and who can live there, which creatures can live there. And eventually it's going to have some impacts on the soil as well, not just the grass itself because of the organic input over many, many years, but also the nutrient input when it burns every few years, which it is along our roadways.
Hmm. Hmm.
Nobody's really had a chance to look at that yet.
Yeah.
There's a guy named Ben Wilder from Southern Arizona who published a paper a couple of years ago called, I can't remember the exact name, but he used the term grassification. And that's something we're all starting to talk about now because that is exactly what's going on in the desert. I
Can you
don't
tell
think
us
it's,
more? Oh, go
pardon
ahead.
me?
Oh, tell me more about this grassification. I know you
Well,
just
it's just that
explained it in great depth, but
it seems to be kind of a positive, not kind of, it is a positive feedback loop. Grass is very flammable. When it burns, there's more nutrients there for a while. There's seeds there. Grass doesn't usually burn hot enough to burn much of the seed bank or all of the seed bank. And so it grows up again, and that makes it even more flammable. And so it's a positive feedback grassland cycle. Like you see in any grassland, the more it burns, for the most part, the happier it is if the grazing is balanced. And so we haven't talked about grazing at all yet. It's been kind of pleasant. I'll say it this far: desert soils are very fragile, and even with the grasses coming in, it's still a very dry, very hot place, and the soils are always going to be pretty fragile down there. Where there's soil disturbance, mechanical disturbance, whether it's humans or livestock, they disturb the surface of the soil. That makes it much more prone to erosion and to some types of other non-native species coming in. And it makes it really hard to predict what's going to happen because, unfortunately, realistically, that brings in a political faction as well.
Mhm,
Some conflicts in how land should be managed. People have different ideas on that.
mhm,
And the overlap of politics and ecology is never a comfortable place to be.
mhm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, you gave us that was a very minor rundown on the grazing piece, erosion, politics. Um, okay, that was fantastic. These are obviously this is a big messy problem, but I'm curious, this is my last question. What kind of keeps you hopeful? What what are you seeing from a solution standpoint that's keeping you, coming to work every day and happy and hopeful?
Honestly, what I feel like I've been able to help with, at least on my forest, is more engagement of our long term firefighters with the land planning. Now, God forbid I tell our firefighters, you have to get engaged in NEPA, but their experience is phenomenal. They know what's going on out there. There's a professor by the name of Don Falk, who, in my mind, is one of the fire gods of the Southwest. There are several of them. He's one of them. And when he teaches classes to firefighters, which he does 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, specifically some of our fire qual classes, RX 310, RX 510, 580, some of those, he
Hmm.
now talks about alternative directions for ecosystems to go. That wasn't normal, even for Don, probably 3 or 4 years ago. When he first did it, I think it was 3 years ago, I heard firefighters saying it's nice to hear somebody talking about what we know is going on because they do know that. When I'm out there on the ground with firefighters, they may not know the name of that plant. They won't know the scientific name most of the time, but they know when it's going to burn. They know how it's going to burn. They know how it's going to respond to fire. They know what's going to impact it, what they can do to change it, all of that. They know a lot of fire ecology, and if they can bring that kind of knowledge to the table, it's going to help us work with fire in the landscape in a much more effective manner.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's once again,
Fantastic.
it's ecology. We have all the parts, we have wildlife and soils and so on. And most of those folks, at least on the Tonto, know a fair bit about fire. But there are the practical realities of fire too. What you can and can't do with fire, what's safe to do, and how you can do it. And so having everybody sit at the table needs to include fire. And fire is one of those weird things that is an emergency response. We have sirens and lights and everything, but it's also a fundamental ecological process that messes things up when we leave it out.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think bringing fire to the table as just part of what you have all the time is really important. And I think I've been able to help with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. That's fantastic. That's a great message. I think that's a big part of this podcast is really trying to maybe give folks on the ground some language and some context for what they're seeing. Obviously, they know a lot and they see a lot and they have a lot of experiential context.
Yes.
But to be able to provide them with that, just a little bit more background, just a bit more language to explain what they're seeing, to contextualize what they're seeing is a big goal of this podcast for sure.
And I'd also want to encourage them to speak up. I'd give one good example. When we first sat down to work on Fry and put together the planning for that, our
Hmm.
wildlife person, Bill Noble, who's a dear friend of mine now, he and I sat down, and the usual thing at the time for Mexican spotted owl habitat was to keep fire out of it. By the time we were done, he was concerned about how we would get fire into it. And part of that exercise was looking at a map and saying, okay, if you want us to keep fire out of this 600-acre pack, the reality is we'd have to pull it back to this ridge, back to this road, over to here, and so on. And so we'd actually be blocking out 3,000 to 5,000 acres that we can't burn. Or I actually did calculus for the first and only time in my job. I figured out the area of exposed soil that we would have to create if we dug like a 3-foot wide mineral line around the pack, aside from the safety to firefighters that would be compromised as well, potentially, in doing that. So bringing that operational realities into NEPA is really important. And it changed the way we did Fry in a lot of ways as well. So for people who are out there starting on engines, or you've been there for a long time, keep your ear out at least. I understand why you wouldn't want to be sitting in a NEPA ID meeting, but at least consider sharing what you know, because it can make a difference. And most firefighters who've been there for a while know a whole lot more than maybe they think they do as far as what's valuable for land management.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on, and just yeah, fantastic summation for the episode. Um, well, cool. I'll let you. This has been a long one. I'll let you get back to your life. I appreciate it so much.
You're welcome.
One thing I didn't actually grab that I need to grab is you saying your name and your position, just as the
Ah,
intro to the episode.
sure. My name is Mary Lata. I'm the fire ecologist for the Tonto National Forest here in Arizona.
Perfect. That was nailed it. I'm glad I remembered that. I was like, at the beginning, I was like, oh, I never got her name and position. Um, just for folks to know who you are when we first start talking. Cool. Well, thanks, Mary. That was fantastic. And I'll let you know when this thing goes live. It should be maybe in June, mid-June or so. So yeah, thank you so
Well, I
much.
have to say, Amanda, I had not heard of your blog before, and I mentioned it to somebody, I think it was late last week, and they're like, "Oh, really? Yeah, that's really good. You should listen to that." And so I'm afraid
Oh,
I
cool.
haven't, but I will be. Oh,
Oh,
thank you.
cool. I really try to explore wildfire from a variety of different topics, ecology and research, but also operations and just trying to find engaging folks within the community. And it's not very hard to do that. There's a lot of you. Um, yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, give
You're
it a listen.
welcome.
Let me know what you think. And thanks for coming on the show.
Okay, thanks for doing what you do.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.